Adversity is a very, very hard thing. Everybody faces it in life. There's no getting away from it. But I think that the greatest adversity that I ever had in my life was when my family, and I was about 16 years old, my family left our house of 13 years in West Hempstead, Long Island, New York, and walked into the witness protection program and traveled 3,000 miles away. That is tough. Of course, if you're going to fight adversity, it's always good to be prepared for it, although that's a lot easier said than done. But I had a very dysfunctional family. My parents were always fighting about money, yet my father was a show-off. He built the house that we lived in. He always had to have the brand new Lincoln Continental. We had the best woolen sack tape recorder, the best stereo system that was out there. We even had intercoms in the house. My older brother had finished high school and started college in the late 60s, early 70s, and my younger brother was about 8 when we went into the witness protection program. And I was a very quiet kid, and moving 3,000 miles away to a new school and kids that I didn't know, that was absolutely horrid for me. But to put everything in perspective, I might as well go back to the beginning, my father's beginning. My father was born in New York City in 1922. His name was Herbert, and he was the son of Ida and Max. They were Russian Jews, and Max became a plumber, started a plumbing business, a very lucrative business, because they lived well. I never met my grandfather. He died about a year and a half before I was born in 1954. My father was a very cute kid, and he had a lot of friends growing up. My brothers and I, we used to make fun because we saw the old pictures. They lived in Brooklyn, as I said, and he would go over the Williamsburg Bridge to the Bowery to see most of his friends. And we saw the pictures and we'd say, hey, you were one of the original Bowery boys. But my father, he was a very, very smart kid. He graduated high school at 14 years old. And then he went to Brooklyn College, and his bachelor's degree was in English, but he became a plumber like his father before him. And when the war started, my father went into the Army. He was stationed in California, where we would ultimately end up. He was a staff sergeant. When he got out, he met a young lady named Shirley. They got married, and they had 2 children named Sandra and Dennis. So things didn't work out with that marriage, and my father and Shirley divorced in, I guess, 49, 50 or so, and then my father met my mom, Irene, who was the daughter of Charlie and Molly, who were Russian Polish Jews. My mother and my father got married in 1951 and stayed together for about 30 years until their divorce. My older brother Bob was born in 1952, and I came along in 1956. We lived on Hubbard Street in Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn, very close to Coney Island. And as the 50s rolled on, my father decided he wanted to move his family out to Long Island, as many people started doing after World War II. So he found a piece of property in West Hempstead on Long Island, and he had a house built. And we moved into that house in 1959. During the 60s, as I had mentioned, I was a very quiet kid, very lonely. I had some friends. I was one of the original monster kids, loved horror films. To this day, I still do. I used to go into the city with my brother Bob a lot. In fact, that was the only period that we really did things together. In school, a bit of an introvert. And as I said, lonely. I did have some friends. They came over sometimes, but I wasn't the type of person that would go to a friend's house every day. In the late 60s, when I was kind of finishing up 6th grade, going into middle school, that's when all of this craziness started with my father. My father in the late 60s, he was a plumbing contractor and who also had gotten into construction contracting because there was more money in it. My father had a partner named Morty, and they bought properties in a lot of low-income areas, renovating these buildings. It was the big thing. My father always told me that when he did work for New York City, the city was very slow in paying. And I do remember one of his properties was South First Street in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, because the summer of 1970, my brother Bob and I, we were working for him. They basically were taking these apartments, gutting them out, putting in new electric, new plumbing, brand new facade on the outside. What's interesting is 1970, my father had already met the loan shark. And that started in the middle of 1968. And the craziness, especially when going through his diaries, what was going on, and you would never know it by seeing this man. It's interesting because in 1969, when my father had already met the loan sharks, I had my bar mitzvah. It was in Great Neck. If you look at our tuxedos, they were not rentals, they were made. And you would never have known it. My father really never knew stress. But unbeknownst to my mom, my brothers, he was going through his own hell, him and his partner.
George, you owned a construction business. You probably came on bad times with it?
Well, I was expanding my construction business, and I had arranged with banks for legitimate finance. I had been committed to $100,000, and 2 days after I got the commitment from each of two banks, Federal Reserve cut back on the banking facilities. I ended up with $10,000 out of $100,000. In the meantime, I had committed myself to going ahead with certain work, and what I could have gotten out of it was a question of honor, which I wonder about whether now, at this late stage, whether it was the right thing to do. However, I had to seek out the money, and it wasn't easy for me. I didn't even know these people who were part of mafia or organized crime or whatever we call them.
From 1968, middle of 1968, April or so, to basically the beginning of 1972, we had no idea what was going on. And it was between April of 1968 and the end of 1970 that my father and his partner Morty had the meetings with the loan sharks. As my father had mentioned, they could not get the money they needed from a bank, and they had to go to another source. Good, bad, or indifferent, this is what happened. My father had a masonry guy named Johnny C. He was a nice guy. He actually had done some of our work in our house at West Hempstead in our basement. Very nice guy. And he said, hey, I got some people I want you to introduce you to, might be able to help you with the business. So my father and Morty went to Johnny C's mother's house, and there met a fellow by the name of Joey M. and another fellow named Joey R. Joey M he should not have been, I'm not sure if he was mafia, I'm not sure, but he was a very, from what I've read in the diaries, and these diaries, by the way, my father had gone back to when he was working with the FBI and being wiretapped. He sometimes made annotations in the diaries in terms of information for when he had to present it in front of the grand jury, because there were a lot of court cases for these guys. Joey M was one of the fellas there, and from the diary, he seemed like a really nice guy. He didn't seem like a mafia guy. He was the voice of reason. Joey R was a bit rough. He was the loan shark, and the way it worked is they got their money from another source. But there were two of them. There was Joey R, and then there was another one who would take his place. And they had an uncle, Angelo, known in the diaries as the other people. They talked about the amount of money that they needed. They were looking to start with $50,000. Ultimately, they got $100,000. Once they paid back $10,000, they would have to start paying back at a 3% VIG. That's VIG. I remember reading that in the diaries. I had no idea what that meant. I did a little bit of research. VIG stands for vigorish, and it is basically the interest for an unofficial debt collector. And the loan sharks would use that and talk about that themselves. It seems at first they were paying about $1,000 a week, and things were going okay. They could do it. They could do it. What was happening, interestingly enough, for the first year, is that the loan sharks were slow in giving the money to my father. Even at one point they were saying that my father and Morty were slow in paying back. They were slow in the way they were giving my father and his partner their money. The very first checks that they got were 4 $500 checks. 3 of them bounced. This went on for, like I said, quite a bit of time. There was a meeting where they got together and Joey R was acting really weird. He was saying, okay, I'm gonna get you guys before they get me. I'm gonna get you guys before they get me. I'm gonna kill you. Your payments are too slow. And my father, and Joey M was there, my father said, listen, we haven't been so slow. You've been slow in giving us money. We'll go somewhere else. And Joey R said, no, we'll get other people. And if you read the diaries, Joey R was getting money from his uncle and he was getting it from his mother. Then there was this fellow Gus who was in the picture, and he brought my father, actually left money at South First Street in Brooklyn. He'd leave a brown paper bag with cash that had Las Vegas wrappers around the cash. That happened a couple of times. And at one point, my father writes in the diary, he said they were really in a position now to do some work, and they couldn't because they didn't have all the money that they were promised by Joey R. And at another meeting, Joey R said to my father, he said, okay, I got an idea that's gonna work. I've done it with my people. What we do is we defraud the bank. We give them phony checks made out to real excessive amount of money, and it works. And from reading the diary, you can just picture my father looking at Morty's face and saying, no, we're not going to do it this way. We want legitimate money. Or I don't want to go into this knowing that we're going to defraud a bank. There was another meeting between my father, Morty, and Joey M, and they were complaining that they weren't getting the money fast enough. Joey M said, we got to talk to Joey R because he actually is in a position where he can lose his life for not getting you the money fast enough. My father felt terrible at this. I said, don't do that. But ultimately, in December of 1969, my father's business took a turn for the worse. He was in financial bind. Money wasn't coming in fast enough, and therefore their payments were slow. Joey M was sitting with my father and Morty, and he was getting very uptight about the delays, and basically said, listen, if you don't pay up, you're going to have to see other people who would not be as nice as me. He had responsibilities for collecting, and he used the phrase, my word is my bond.
The original collectors seemed to be an errand boy, although, as I say, I wasn't aware that he was. It was only until things got tough and it became difficult to make the regular payments.
Then what happened? Things got tough, you missed
Then they
payment.
brought in a new enforcer who was rougher with the tongue, rougher with his actions. He attempted to use a little force.
So in December of 1969, it could have been January of 1970, there was a meeting with my father, Morty, Joey M, and a new fellow who was going to take the place of Joey R, Crazy Vinny. He said to my father and Morty, okay, you guys, you got to stop fooling around. You owe us money. You knew what you got into when you got into this, right? And my father was trying to be nice and say the amount of money that he and Morty had paid so far, and Crazy Vinny said, I don't care about that shit. I only care about the $100 grand and my vig that I'm supposed to get. Joey M was at that meeting and sitting there silently, although later on he showed that he did have a bit of clout. They were still constantly having meetings. More phone meetings now were happening. Crazy Vinny was asked by my father and Morty could, maybe the weekly payments could be lessened, and that would happen a few times. But Vinny said, no, make your payments. And we'll see about that. And my father and Morty they got their payments up, but unfortunately the payments that were late, now the payments behind them were late. They were constantly being threatened. And for some reason, poor Morty was always the butt end. I guess because my father was cool or what have you, but Morty was forever being kicked and punched. There were several meetings that came up during the following months. They were always behind. Crazy Vinny talked about legitimate factors in terms of helping the construction company. And they were talking to my father and Morty about this, but it never really led to anything. Vinny wanted to actually be a part of it. And I don't know if he wanted to go legitimate or what have you, but basically it just turned out, my father kind of intimated in the diaries that there wasn't one legitimate part of Vinny. He just was a crook to the end. So that kind of dried up, although he did make mention that they would look upon that for themselves to see if they can get other investors. Evidently that never really came to be. The thought process next was to actually go to banks again and try to get some loans, legitimate loans, based on the construction business at that particular point in time, but they still had problems. They really couldn't get anything. Even Vinny tried to make a loan. Oh, we're going to go to this bank and they all know me there. Well, went to the bank and nobody knew who Vinny was. And then they started talking about a paper loan, and I found that was a mortgage to try and get some money based on the mortgages they had. All of this stuff that was just topsy-turvy. None of that seemed to work out. There was one meeting where Morty was there, and Crazy Vinny said to Morty,
"Herb, I hate that guy. If he were here, I'd gouge his eyes out and chew him to bits."
In the diary, my father had it actually as June, but then he wrote in there for the grand jury, he said it could have been in July. He was asked to come with Morty to a meeting by Joey M. downtown in the city, and they were going to meet somebody, Uncle Angelo. So they go up the steps and to this round table. There's some people there, and my father, Morty, Crazy Vinny was there, and Joey M. sat down, and Uncle Angelo.
"You guys have been screwing around long enough with me. Where is the money? I want my money. Where is it? Where the hell is my money? You've been putting a lot of pressure on Vinny. I want my money. Where's my money?"
Sir, I don't think I got your name.
I ain't got a name. You don't need to know my name. I want my money. Go rob a bank if you have to. Get a gun. If he didn't give you a gun, if you didn't got a gun, go get my money.
He walked out. A few minutes later, my father and Morty and Joey M. walked down. They really didn't say much to anybody about, any future meetings. They just needed to have some quiet time. At the end of the day, my father came home from work and everything was normal. Little did we know that only a few hours before, his very life was threatened.
But there isn't a borrower that has done business with the mafia that at one time or another hasn't heard the classic line, "We'll give you a gun, you go get the money for us." That is everybody's line.
What happened when you didn't pay a bank or a finance company? What they said?
Never said, "We'll give you a gun."
Then there was one day, my father came back to the office unexpectedly, and Crazy Vinny was there. Morty was in the office by himself.
"Where's Herb? I want my fucking money."
Vinny, I'm sorry. Herb's not here. I don't know the combination.
My father came in. Now Vinny's holding the gun. He said, "Open the safe." My father opens it. There's nothing in there. And my father said, he said, "Listen, Vinny.
Listen, Vinny.
You got to give us some time, okay? We're practically near bankruptcy. The sheriff has been giving us eviction notices. You got to try and let us sell some of our properties." He also spoke about maybe Uncle Angelo might be interested in taking over some of the mortgages, in which Vinny said, "Well, I got to talk to him about that." And all the while, my father didn't drink, but he had scotch in the office, and crazy Vinny was drinking the scotch.
You guys have fooled around enough. Uncle Vinny's got to get his money.
And he said, you know, I was supposed to come here tonight and kill yous, because I got to tell you something. My government is different than your government. When we're dealing with people like you or people that my government does business with and they go to the cops, my government knows about it before they leave the precinct. Vinny told my father, if you want to know more about my government, read the book, The Godfather. Now, this was in 1970. This is before it became a movie. And my father and Morty spoke to Joey M. He said, listen, can we please reduce the amount of payments? And Joey M. was getting uptight. He said, listen, you don't need this shit. He said, if you can make some payments, maybe I can persuade them to lower your weekly amounts. It was coming towards the end of 1970. It was the High Holy Holidays. And first, Vinny gives a call to Morty. It was Rosh Hashanah. He said, I want to meet you guys. And Morty said, it's Rosh Hashanah. We can't do it tonight. And Vinny said to him, he says, well, you believe in that shit? And he goes, yes, I believe in God. Don't you believe in God? And Vinny said,
my God is money and women.
Following week is Yom Kippur. My father gets a call from him. And my father says, it's Yom Kippur, I can't do it. And Vinny says,
you don't come downtown to me, I'm going to come to your house, kick your fucking door in, and bad things are going to happen.
They didn't come to my home only because I kept on paying them. If I had stopped paying them, they would have been at my home. They would have been at my wife and kids.
Morty and my father meet Vinny in the city. They're downtown at someone's apartment. Vinny is ranting. The meeting that they had before ended with Vinny looking at Morty saying,
you're scared, huh?
Oh, a little more time. We said we'll get you the money. It's not a problem. I'm very sorry, but there's no problem. You will get the money.
Every week you're late with the money, I cut off a finger.
So the first thing when my father gets downtown, crazy Vinny's got some kind of green bottle that he wants to throw at my father. Joey M gets in the middle. And Vinny just throws it to the ground. They go upstairs.
Hey, Paisan, choke that guy. Let him go. That's no way to kill a guy. The way you kill a guy is to make him part of an automobile, so his family can't get the insurance.
Somehow the meeting goes into the kitchen and Vinny goes and gets a metal pot.
Motherfucker, cocksucker, piece of shit.
My father grabs a pot and he's about to like bash Vinny with it. Joey M gets in the middle again.
Stop! Oh, stop! Easy! Stop!
My face is disorder, though.
No. Easy. Peace.
Crazy Vinny is ranting in Italian, cursing. Except for a few more entries, this was the end of the diary. Now it was time for Morty and my father to go to the FBI. They had no money to pay these guys back, and they needed help.
You paid back the interest, and you paid back the loan, and the man said you still owe $200,000. How did he justify that?
Oh, there doesn't have to be a justification for what they say. I mean, they can devise their own means of mathematics. They don't have to use an abacus. They don't have to use the fingers. Anything that they decide is something that you have to accept. And if you're going to go along with their premise, then you will accept it.
The FBI was certainly interested in my father and Morty and their story. They wanted to get these guys. I also believe, although I don't know this 100%, but I believe they must have given my father and Morty some money to appease these guys so that when they had their meetings and they were wiretapped, they could talk about business and not like, I want to get my money, you bastard. And that happened evidently for about a year. I don't have any documentation or diaries about the FBI wiretaps of my father and Morty. I only know that it happened during 1971. The FBI introduced my dad and Morty to the U.S. Marshal Service and their newest entity, the Federal Witness Protection Program, something that would be etched into my brain for the rest of my life. It wasn't until the end of 1971 or the beginning of 1972 that my dad gathered his family one Sunday morning and told us what was happening.
I'm curious about the anguish that must have fallen upon your families in all of these circumstances. The loans, the exorbitant interest, the fear you felt, the beating up that you sustained. What happened with your wives and children?
Well, for myself, my wife and children were never made aware of it until after I went to the government. I was able to keep it from them that these were not, or were, mafia.
At the tail end of 1971, the beginning of 1972, can't remember exactly, my father one Sunday morning for breakfast called my mother and my two brothers and myself into the kitchen. And he said, okay, I have to tell you something. And he went into the whole thing about building his business, not being able to get enough money together through the banks, and he had to go see other people in order to keep his business going, keep the family going, and was always thoughtful that he'd be able to pay back, he and his partner. And now he had mentioned, you know, the wiretaps, and now starting the next day, Monday, he would have company. He was going to have a deputy marshal with him 24/7. At first it was one, and then it was two. And, you know, of course we had so many questions, you know, like why, how, whatever. He did talk about ultimately, while waiting for trial, that eventually we would have to move. But he was talking about moving upstate. We didn't really get into it too much. My father had the deputies. I would say after the first week, they did show us some mugshots. One guy was Crazy Vinny. Can't forget about Crazy Vinny. The other guy was Uncle Angelo. The third guy, I do not remember. But what's interesting is there were a few mornings after I saw these pictures, I was walking to school, as I always did, going down Hawthorne Street onto Nassau Boulevard to West Hempstead High School, and there was a guy standing outside of a house. And darn if he didn't look like Uncle Angelo. There was a couple of mornings that I saw him. I was just looking as I was going by, he was a spitting image. So I remember that night, my father came home with the deputy or deputies. I don't remember if he had one or two at that point. And I said, listen, when I'm going to school, I'm seeing this guy. And he said, are you sure? And I said, I believe so. Again, I was 15, going on 16. So the next morning, I go to school, and behind me is a car with one of the deputy marshals, and he's following me. I'm walking down the street, and there in front of me is Uncle Angelo. And I kind of do one of these things, looking behind me and kind of like pointing. I went off to school, did not look around. Later that night, I had to find out what happened, and my father came home, the deputies were there, and the first thing they said, Mark, he looked exactly like him, but it was not him, and he basically was waiting for his carpool. And wouldn't you know it, from then on, every day when I went to school, I did not see that fellow outside of his house. I guess he was too scared. It was interesting having the deputies. I remember when the movie The French Connection came out, was at the old Calderon Theater in Hempstead, which is now a church. And it was a long line outside. And there were two deputies. I do remember that. One of them said, hold on. He goes across the street, less than 5 minutes, he's back. And he says, come with me. We go in. At the entrance of the Calderon Theater is a manager. And the deputy takes out his wallet, shows his badge, says, I am a United States Deputy Marshal. This is my client. He is a government witness, too dangerous to be out on the street. I'm taking them in. So we didn't have to pay. We saw the movie. It was great. The marshals were very cordial. They would be totally unobtrusive. They would come in, they would sit down. A lot of times my mother would ask them if they'd want dinner. Usually they would say no, but sometimes they had dinner. We had repeaters. It got to the point where some of the same guys would be with my father. And sometimes on a sleepless night, I would walk down the hall and come into what we called the family room. That's where they were sitting, and it would be very commonplace to see their guns and holsters on the table. The summer of '72 came, and my father said, look, we have to start looking for a place to relocate to. We have to move. So we went upstate. He went to see a few properties. And then one night my father came home, he dropped the bomb. He said, no, this is not going to do any good. The Marshal Service wants us to move far away, like 3,000 miles. So that following week, my father took a trip to California. He went to Northern California. He went to a town called Placerville. In the old gold days, it was known as Old Hangtown. 44 miles east of Sacramento and 130 miles east of San Francisco, the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. He brought back pictures. Unfortunately, we don't have any of those pictures except for one. He found this house, a pink house. Outside the house were mesh wired fences that were holding in pigs and dogs and llamas and cows. The fellow who owned it was a veterinarian. He lived there with his family, and we heard rumors that he was an alcoholic. He needed to move. I remember saying, Dad, really? And yeah, this is where we were going to move to. So by the time he acquired the house, it was towards the tail end of the summer. I was really in denial. I felt, all right, something's gonna fall through and we're not gonna have to move. So I went into 11th grade, and things were, as normal as they could possibly be. It was now the start of Christmas vacation, the last day that I was in West Hempstead High School. I was still in denial because I felt that something was going to happen and we weren't going to move. And I'd never see these kids again that I went to school with, some of them since kindergarten. And I remember I was in a Spanish class, and my teacher, I think her name was Miss Casanova, and she said to me, Mark, I'm going to see you next year, right? And the way she said it, I felt like she knows. I said, yes, absolutely, absolutely.
When you make that move to tell the government what they want to know about loan sharking,
They do make a very valid attempt. They relocate you.
I remember December 27th, a couple of days after Christmas, we woke up that morning and the moving men came, moving company that was set up by the U.S. Marshal Service. And they came and started to pack our things. And of course, me, Mr. Paranoia, they went straight for my records. But I saw that they were putting them into the box. Everything looked okay, but I figured, all right, I better go into another room. And I remember my father was sitting with my brother Philip on his lap saying, "Your name is going to be Harwood now. Harwood, can you say that?" Later that morning, my mother, father, and two brothers, we walked out of 623 Hawthorne Street. And that was it. We went into a car with the deputy marshals and went to Kennedy Airport and took a flight to Sacramento, California.
I've known Mark for several years. We went to high school together, and it was really nice until one day Mark and the family were gone. And there was no explanation. He was not in school. And it was really hard. Mark and I were really close. All the friends kept saying, "Jan, where's Mark and the family?" And I couldn't tell them. I knew for a while where they were, but I was not allowed to say. For their protection, I could not say anything whatsoever. Then one day, Mark and his family wound up coming next door to us, living in their aunt's house, and I was totally ecstatic. I call him my brother from another mother because we were that tight, and we are still to this day that tight.
We stayed at the Sacramento Inn. We stayed there for about 2 weeks because the house wasn't ready yet. The people hadn't moved yet, so then we had to stay in an apartment nearby. I remember in the back were tracks for a freight train, the type of freight train that comes at 10 p.m. and doesn't leave until 45 minutes later. And we all went up to see the house, the pink house. And there were the mesh wired fences with the dogs and the pigs and the horses and muddy ground. And I remember as we walked towards the house, my brother and I were talking, well, you know, we're going to have to paint it white, which we ultimately did. We went inside and we met the veterinarian, the alcoholic veterinarian and his family. And that was that for a while. February 1st, I started school. I really should have started right after New Year's, but we were getting still acclimated there. And my dad would have to drive me 44 miles to and from. I went to Ponderosa High School in Shingle Springs, California, which is right next door to Placerville. It was a nice school, nice campus. It looked more like a college campus. It was separate buildings. And all my worries came true. I was made fun of because of my Brooklyn accent. I was bullied. The kids who wore the cowboy hats were the bullies. That's the way it seemed. And I remember I had a few friends. I mean, they never came over to my house, but during lunch, there was a little grassy knoll that we used to sit on, and that was nice. And life went on in California. I had a few pet peeves about the Placerville, Sacramento area. First off, Chinese food. There was a nice Chinatown in Sacramento, but they didn't have duck sauce. They never heard of duck sauce. My whole life, I had always put duck sauce on my Chinese food, and now, nothing. Terrible. Television reception. We got horrible reception. This was in the early days of cable, and obviously there was no cable in Placerville, and we couldn't even get a good picture from 44 miles away in Sacramento. The only saving grace was a few months later, the famous Sutro Tower in San Francisco went online, and we got great reception from 130 miles away. Now, I don't know what it's like today, but when we went, there were no Jews in Placerville, except us. On Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Ponderosa High School was open for business. Bummer. It's the middle of February 1973. We are ready to move into our house. We get there. The moving truck comes from Washington, D.C., where all of our things have been stored for the last 2 months or so by the U.S. Marshal Service. Everything came in, we unpacked, everything was pretty good, but, and it's a big but, there were certain things that were not there. There was a color TV that was missing from my bedroom, and there were a couple of items that my father, being a construction contractor, had found in buildings that they were renovating. One was a Tudor throne that was dilapidated, but it was a really nice chair with the lion's feet and the paws for the handles of the chair. My mother had it redone in red velvet. It's unfortunate that we have no color pictures of it. It's more unfortunate that it was stolen. And then we also had a Venus statue. I'm not sure where this came from, but I know that I saw in the pictures my father had gotten it even back in Brooklyn. It was in the backyard of their Hubbard Street home, and it was in the backyard of my house on West Hempstead. My father spoke with the Marshal Service. We'll check into it. Of course, nothing ever happened. Somebody got it. We didn't. I do want to mention that when we left our house, the Witness Protection Program was only in effect for 2 years. And it is different than what it is today. Today, if somebody comes into the protection program, the Witness Protection Program, he is paid $60,000. It could be more, but it's basically $60,000. When my father came in 1972, he was not paid anything. If the witness has any debt, he has to clear it up. If he has to declare bankruptcy, he declares bankruptcy. And he's expected to get a job. Now, when we went in, the Witness Protection Program, which is run by the U.S. Marshal Service, they told my father, we will help you get a job. My father owed so much back mortgage on our house. He had a car repossessed, utilities, he owed everybody. When we walked out of the house, he was debt-free. And like I said, today they don't do that anymore. Another thing that the Witness Protection Program does today, as it did from the very beginning, is that the witness has to change their last name and the family also. And then I have a document, which is a change of name. If I ever have to use a passport, I can show that document. Originally, they wanted us to change not only our last name, but our first name. And they chose a name. They chose the name Rawlings. And I always laughed at that because I remember the old movie, How the West Was Won, and the family's name was Rawlings. We have a paper that has first names that they decided on. And I remember my brother Bob, they wanted to call him Jackson Rawlings. And my mother wasn't going to have that at all. No way was that going to happen. And it didn't. But the biggest thing is that the Witness Protection Program told my father, had told them, and continued to tell him, we're going to help you to get a job. That never happened. My mother was upset unbelievably. My father spoke with his Marshal Service people, and we're going to get you a job, and they didn't.
The marshals who bring you to the new place with the new name and the new everything, they don't have any part in getting you a job?
No. They're supposed to.
No, it's not them.
Well, no, they're supposed to aid at the behest of the Washington office. But I think you'll find that the people in Washington, as Erwin said before, they're cold to a point because they really don't know what the score is. They've been thrust into this program just as we might have been thrust in, and they really haven't been prepared for it. They're totally incapable of giving you the proper background, the proper identity, and I think it's because they are not the professionals that the FBI
They're not.
My father got some work on his own, just as a regular plumber, not even a contractor. I remember going to a house in downtown Placerville with him, and he had to do work under the sink, and this was a really disgusting, dirty house. The sink was full of plates, and it was dirty, and ugh. Then he became a boat salesman, of all things, for a short period of time, and then he got a position, a contracting position in San Francisco. So he was driving 260 miles per day, 130 miles in each direction. I remember one time standing outside of the house and a runaway horse came down the block in front of us, which was something that you usually wouldn't see on Long Island, I guess unless you lived close to a horse farm. My mother was always complaining about the grass where we lived. It was always brown. She asked, what time of year does it turn green? And she was told, well, in October it's green for about 2 weeks. But my mother was absolutely homesick. She missed her parents. She missed her mahjong friends. She just missed her whole way of life. Sometimes I would walk into our backyard, which was more like a huge prairie. I guess some people would have loved to have the acreage that we had, and I love this type of terrain, but not then. I've been back to California many times since 1972 and enjoyed it. My honeymoon was there, but back then I was homesick and I felt all alone. I may sound like Taxi Driver, but loneliness has followed me my whole life. And sometimes I would tell my mom that I was very lonely, and she would tell me the same thing. And then she'd hug me, and we would both cry. Things were getting hot and heavy again with my parents' arguments, and a lot of it had to do with, Herb, they promised you a job. You said you would get a job. My older brother was in college. He was going to Sacramento State. My younger brother was in Charlie Brown School, in elementary school. And I felt like I was getting more of the brunt end of this whole thing. I was entirely homesick. I loved New York, and where we were now was just not making it. If we had moved to Los Angeles, or we had moved closer to San Francisco, might have been a different thing, but this was terrible. Anyway, 1973 became 1974. My father had to go back to New York a few times because court cases against the loan sharks were starting. The wiretaps had worked, and they found the people that needed to be found. On one of his trips back to New York, he met an old associate of his father, my grandfather's. And this fellow wanted my father to help run the plumbing business, and it was good. So in March of 1974, my father spoke to the principal of my high school, Mr. Ciccarelli, and asked if I could leave 3 weeks earlier. So in March of 1974, he went back to New York with my mother and my younger brother Philip. My older brother Bob and myself were left, so Bob could finish up his college and me, school and get out 3 weeks early. 2 months after they all left, my father came back. He flew in. We couldn't wait for him to drive up in this humongous truck. It was a 20 or 30 footer. I don't remember exactly what. And my brother and I, a few days before, had started packing up the house. First we relocated, and now we're relocating again to go back home. The Witness Protection Program is very proud of the fact that all of its witnesses who have been in the program since 1970, no one has ever been killed. What transpired with the U.S. Marshals, I have no idea, because you're not supposed to go back, and if you do, you're on your own. So they couldn't force my father to be there, and he was still a witness. So anyway, he drove up. We packed everything in, and my father had a way of just, if it didn't fit, to push it in. So of course my records and stereo system went in last. We then drove to a nearby gas station where they hitched up our Mercury station wagon to the back of the truck, and we were off. We started later in the day, so we got back to New York in 3 days and 4 nights. Our first night we spent in Sparks, which is a city close to Reno, Nevada. Next day we were driving through the desert and we ran out of gas. That was fun, but we weathered that. The next night we were in Utah. The night after that we were somewhere in Illinois. And the next night at 10 p.m. we were driving over the George Washington Bridge. Absolutely wonderful. We were back in New York, baby. Oh my goodness. I remember it was maybe 11 p.m., 11:30. We got to my aunt's house in West Hempstead. My mother and Philip were there, my grandmother, they all greeted us. We were back. We stayed there for about 2 weeks, and then we rented a house in Lynbrook, nearby West Hempstead. And then after that, my father decided to renovate my aunt's house, his sister Sylvia, and he made it bigger. The effects of the witness protection program were pretty tumultuous on each and every one of us. I know when I came back, I went to school at night for a little bit, then I was working in a mailroom in the city. Eventually I went to college full-time for film production. And I developed a really bad anxiety and panic disorder, which started with the relocation and then just got really bad, especially by 1992. It was off the charts. And I got married in the mid-'80s, and that lasted about 26 years. Had 2 beautiful children, Alex and Samantha. When my ex and I split up, and I met a wonderful woman named Maria, who we married a few years later. She's the most caring, most loving person in the world, and I could not function if it wasn't for her. My mother, when we got back, she started to gain weight and got very reclusive and stayed in the house, would not go out. And eventually in the late 90s, she had dementia. Things got worse, and the last 10 years of her life, she was in a nursing home as a vegetable, did not know if anybody was around. She passed away in 2010. My father, he was actually asked to go on the old David Susskind show. They were doing a story on loan sharks and their victims. When my father came back from California in 1974, he decided to start writing a book. Now, you would think that it would have been on what had happened in the last few years on the loan sharks and the witness protection program, but no, he decided to write a work of fiction. And he was working with the David Susskind Publishing Company, and I guess he told the guys there what he had been doing the last few years, and they told him that Susskind was doing the Loan Shark show, and that's how he got invited to be on that.
Today, have they given up on you, the Mafia, and said, ah, hell, he blew town, at least nobody knows he's around, and that he beat us for the money?
I wouldn't be wearing this. No, nobody really knows, David. How can you possibly tell unless you're going to go back to them and ask? And we're not in a position to ask. We're away from here, and I care less. We don't want to know them.
As I had mentioned, he was working for an associate of his father's, my grandfather's, running a business. My father never showed stress, but he hated working for this guy, and I never saw my father so stressed. He decided he was going to have his own business again. He stopped working for this fellow, started his own business. P.S. It failed. In 1982, the house that my aunt had lived in for about 35, 40 years, the same house that my father renovated when we came back, we walked out of that house as a foreclosure. 10 years after the first house that we left to go to California, I was very frantic about what was happening to the house, that it was going to go into foreclosure. And I happened to have a phone number from one of the deputy marshals that my father had at his side in 1972. I mean, I had that phone number all through going to California, coming back, going to college. I don't remember the deputy's name, but I called him. And he was now a full-fledged marshal. I want to thank you so much for being so kind to my father and my family before we went to California 10 years ago. That's okay. We've had some new problems. My mother and father broke up last year. They're going to get divorced. And my father had started a new business, and it failed, and we're losing the house. It's going to go into foreclosure. Oh, wow. I was wondering if there was anything you could possibly do to help us. Well, Mark, you made the decision to come back here. There's not much that we can do. Yeah, but I didn't make the decision to come back here. My father made the decision to come back here. Mark, you live in the danger zone. I'm sorry, can't do anything. My father was having an affair with his secretary, who was 25 years his junior, eventually marrying her. Her name was Ricarda. And he went back to school. He went back and got his master's degree in teaching. And for the last 10 years of his business life, he was teaching plumbing for New York City Vocational School. In 1992, there was a retirement/birthday party for him. I had made my peace with my father a long time before. He did not come to our wedding, and I probably didn't speak to him for months, not years, because life is way, way too short. A few years after that honorary dinner, he started to develop Alzheimer's. And he and his wife moved to Florida, Orlando. I remember my ex and my children, we went down to visit, and you could see he was very forgetful. He passed away in 2000. I do miss my mother and father very, very much. And if there is an up there, I hope that they're civil and friendly to one another. In closing, in 2011, my son was a fencer in high school and college. And he went to these tournaments called nationals that were held around the country in different cities, and I went to a few with him. This last one was in Reno, Nevada, and my daughter and I flew out to see Alex on his very last day, and we were going to take a road trip through the Sierra Nevadas to Lake Tahoe, which we had never been to before, and ultimately go to San Francisco. But on the way, we were going to stop at that house in Placerville that I had lived in at the time 37 years before. And we did that. And it's interesting because it was all videoed, and because I remember when we were on the street, which was Greenstone Road. It was a winding road, and our house was the only house that was on the side of the road. All the other houses in this little valley were up a bit in the hills. But our house was the only one that was right on the road. And as we got closer, I could tell that everything looked familiar. The corrals across the street. But as we got closer to the house, there were these hedges, these high hedges on the side of the road, which certainly weren't there when we lived there. It was a driveway. We turned in, and there was green grass, not any of that brown grass. And there was the White House that was once pink, but looking a bit more opulent. In the backyard was a vineyard. It was beautiful, and I believe we even saw a peacock. We went to the door, and a woman came out, and I explained who I was, and I thought she'd call the police.
You happen to know where the septic tank is?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, that's what...
And my father, who was a plumbing contractor, probably did, but sadly he's no longer here. Oh. And I remembered the living room, and on the other side of the living room was a dining room, and in between was a fireplace that had white bricks. And then we went upstairs, and I went into the room that I stayed in, that I slept in for a year and a half. And it was a very strange feeling. When we were finished and we said goodbye, I came out and I said something into the camera because my son was videoing, and I started crying. And basically, even then, I cried for my mother and for my father And I was also crying because I knew that my marriage wasn't going to go that much further. And I did this documentary for a number of reasons. I wanted to tell the story. I was thinking about writing it as a book, but being a filmmaker, I decided, okay, let's do it this way. And I wanted to have closure. Did I get it? That's to be seen. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if my father had not taken any money from the bad guys. How would life have been different? But I'm very big at would have, could have, what if. And the years, sometimes when you go away from an event, it gets a little better. And it has, but in certain ways it hasn't. And my wife, God bless her, she takes a lot from me, and she is my rock, because without her, you wouldn't be seeing this, because I wouldn't have been here to make this. But I still keep going on. And because I try to have hope. We have to have hope. We have to. It's the only way, right?